Hello and welcome to MetaNights. I'm Loku, a collector of stories, where we tell your story. Today's storyteller is named Wei. He immigrated to Australia in 2012.
My name is Wei, and I am 35 years old. I come from China. I have had the idea of immigrating for the longest time. To be honest, it was because I was one of the earliest people to climb over the wall and use Twitter, so during that time I actually had some thoughts about this society and felt some frustration.
With the idea of immigration, Wei set his sights on Melbourne, Australia. You applied to Deakin University's accounting program. This major is Chinese, called the immigration major, so that after arriving there, you will find that 80–90% of the surrounding students are Chinese. Do you remember what day you arrived in Australia?
It was October 16, 2012. I arrived at night, around 12 o'clock or so, because a friend of mine was here and he came to pick me up in the middle of the night, while it was raining heavily. He took me to his house where I stayed temporarily. The next day, I remember that it was especially clear when I woke up in the morning. I didn't see much of the surroundings or the environment at night, but when I woke up the next morning and stood in the kitchen drinking water, I saw the bright sunshine, the singing birds and flowers, and someone running at the intersection outside. At that time, the haze in China was still quite serious, especially for me, coming from Chongqing. The sky was so blue and the clouds were so white. At that moment, I had a feeling of awe, because I've never really liked running, but I like playing sports. But when I saw that scenery, I told myself that if I had such an environment, I would also go running. That moment really left a deep impression on me, as my first impression of Australia.
After arriving in Australia, the first problem to solve is to make money, because he has more than 300,000 yuan a year in expenses there, and his savings are far from enough. Later, a high school classmate who came to Australia a few years before him showed him a way. This classmate was very interesting. He came to Australia in 2004 and touched the traditional way of Chinese students to work. Dishes were washed in restaurants and apples were picked in orchards. Finally, he found one of the easiest ways to make money, and that is to drive a taxi. Taxis in Australia are mainly Indians. Chinese know very little about the industry, but it's especially suitable for international students like Wei. Because the taxi work is relatively free, he cannot pick up when he needs to go to class, and his income is very considerable.
I was driving a special car at the time. I was driving a maxi taxi. It's a van, carrying more than 1 ton, and then it can sit inside, except for the driver can accommodate 10 passengers. And it also has a special point. This taxi is actually a government special. It will have subsidies, used to solve, the local disabled people's travel problems. It has been modified in the back, with a hoist, which can allow passengers in wheelchairs to be lifted directly from the hoist and then driven into the car. That is, disabled people can sit in the taxi, and this car's income will be higher than that of the small cars we usually see. One is that it can be used by more people in Australia here, and the regulation is that if you travel with more than 5 people, because ordinary cars can only be in 4, the rate will be increased, at the time, 50% or more. I forgot. And the second is that we will go specifically to pull this kind, because in Australia there are many people who like to go out in groups to drink or something, especially to pull this kind of activity. His income is higher, and the second is disabled people. Disabled people have additional subsidies. When you lift his wheelchair from the ground, it is called lifting. There is a fee called lifting fee. At that time, my lifting was 16 Australian dollars. Just that is to say, you haven't done anything, the car hasn't started yet, just lifted onto the car, and there are already 16 Australian dollars. Actually, I had a driver's license in China, but I never drove. So when I started driving a taxi for the first time, I had only been driving for about 4 months. That's why I started taking the car to work around 8 o'clock in the morning and then watched the tasks pop up on the small computer. I did until around 9 o'clock and none of them were accepted. It's a bit hard to let go of your hand. At that time, I was wondering if I should accept this task or not. Is this a good task? Because I had heard from friends some of their strategies, that is, which tasks can make more money and so on. Actually, now looking back, it was just an excuse for myself. I gave myself the idea that this task is not good, but actually, this gave myself psychological construction, feeling that it is not good enough. I seem to have no way to immediately face the passenger. Maybe it took more than an hour to accept the first task. And then it was also a mess. Including that, greeting the guests, after greeting, ask him where to go. It was a normal middle-aged man, because I came, actually, at that time, it was only a few months, not much contact with local people, and also knew that the Australian accent was very different from the American accent we usually heard in China. As a result, it was very tense. When he told me the name of the place, I got in the car and started to input it into the GPS on the small computer. It took me a long time and the passenger was getting a little impatient. It wasn't until about 3 or 5 minutes after I had started driving that I realized I had forgotten to enter the destination because I was too nervous. The passenger asked me where the meter was, but he was still quite understanding. In the end, the first fare was around $20 and I made about $10. I was very happy to have it in my pocket. Driving here is actually quite risky. I never do the so-called late shift, which is after midnight, because the shifts are always 2 turns. Sometimes it might make more money at night, but I never drive because I think it's dangerous because I'll encounter all kinds of drunken men, robberies, because all the bad guys here know there is cash in taxes. My partner is actually my friend who usually takes over from me. He works the late shift and is often hit with a steel pipe in the car. If someone tries to climb in, he just knocks on it. He also encounters people who try to evade fares, which is too many. There are some kids who don't plan to pay from the start. When he realizes this is the case, especially when he finds this clue in his conversation with them, he will drive the car directly to the side of the wall, because the van has a sliding door and can only be opened on one side, and close it directly against the wall. Tell you now to pay or don't expect to leave. I personally have not had particularly dangerous situations because I am quite cautious. When strange people arrive, there will be strange things. For example, there is a cab culture here, a very bad culture, when I came to here, called sex fare. Some women, young women, they will use their bodies, use sex as this fare to do this. I've never met such a direct, but I've met a very strange thing. I was in that. Also the bar, people have been enough. That car can fit 10 people. At that time there were not 11 people, a group of girls. Also a person said, "You let me squat in the inside in a little?" I said no, this violation, because there will be a fine. The fine is very heavy, I certainly cannot. Suddenly, one of them, he squatted inside that car. He wanted to say hide there, because there are only 10 seats, they have 11 people. He hid inside. He said it does not matter, just give me a ride. I hide inside. I said no. As a result, a girl came to my side of the cab and said to me, she said, so. Suddenly while saying, she lifted up the dress t-shirt, nothing inside, and her breasts were exposed. I said, what does this mean? She said, you can touch. I said that cannot, I cannot. I said I can't do this illegal thing. I said you should either split 2 cars. I really did not know how to take that word at that moment. I also really did not know how to react. A little girl, young little girl about a teenager, probably should be more than 18 to go to the bar. Maybe I may look like this, also 18, 19 years old it. A few years ago there was also an Indian man was accused, that is, sued him for rape, but actually later forensics found that it was sex fare, because all the rental cars actually have cameras in, the police are able to pull out. Finally he was acquitted. They will do such a thing for the fare, because one is the fare itself is not actually cheap. You think it is so little, but he is likely to spend like we drive a trip, If the place is particularly far, or a particularly large number of people, that trip maybe a fare is 90, 100 Australian dollars. What is the concept of 100 Australian dollars? Well, at that time more than 600 yuan, and then if he is a part-time worker, he made an ordinary job, the minimum now is 18 hours, 18 yuan an hour, the hourly rate, 100 yuan is already 5-6 hours, most of the day. I came here to drive to 1-2 months later, has begun to be more familiar. I am particularly impressed should be, one night about 11:30 p.m. I was in a suburb 30 kilometers away from the city centre. Because this place in Australia, this place in Melbourne, is very different from the domestic, except for a small area in the city centre. Other places are actually like the countryside, can be called large rural areas. In the suburbs everyone lives in that kind of place, and then may not even have street lights. I picked up a carload of guests, 7-8 people who were having a party at home and drinking, because it was too late at night to continue to make trouble at home, because there will be complaints, so they called a rental car and decided to continue to the city side, and then drink. A bunch of young people, wearing shorts and slippers, and then holding the wine in their hands. I was still over there, and kept making noise, got into my car and then, we drove from there to the city, drove to a small road, not yet to the big road place, the place even street lights are not, is a single lane, two-way single lane, there is only one lane. When I was driving, I suddenly heard a bang, and from my driver's window, there was a motorcycle flying across the street. From the side flew past, and then a person followed the roll, just a moment flew past. At that moment, I actually thought quite a few things. Including saying how this is the first idea, the second idea is what to do? Do you want to stop and take a look? Immediately the third idea covered over, that is, do not be nosy. Here in front of the back did not see other cars, in fact, at that time on my car and flying past the motorcycle. Then in case something happens even a witness is not. There are no street lights, nothing. The third is that there is a group of drinking to half of the car is ready to go to find happy guests, I cannot delay them, and now he is spending the money to buy this service, so I continued to drive ahead. Well, did not drive out 50 meters, that less than 50 meters. The whole car screamed, it was with screaming. Why didn't you stop the car? It was in the tone of probably a bit of responsibility, asking me, stop, why not stop? I was at that moment, I immediately from just that thought among the switch out, there is a thought, very ashamed. It may not be politically correct to say so. But I said to myself, I am really still Chinese. I had this very typical Chinese thought, and they turned out to be completely absent. They immediately called me off and turned my head over. When I turned my head back, that I had another car coming behind me, he had stopped, and then the man pulled over to the side of the road, with double flashes. Then about 30-50 meters away from where the man was lying down, with double flashes, and then he waved to me over there, and then told me that I also parked on the other side of him, and we sandwiched it in the middle, and then put the double flashes on, and parked it over there, not too close, and then started all the people down. Some people went to check his condition, some people were calling to the police, call the ambulance, and then there are people standing on the outside of the car. Is the car with double flashes, there is no other car coming, go to that position to maintain the order. This person is very interesting, the man is a bearded man, he drove a Harley motorcycle, but also very fierce man-like, and tattoos, and then the ambulance and the police came to find that he seems to have no serious injury, and people, I remember when the police finally had to lift up, he came to see his situation, patted his face, and then see him nothing special, he looked up at the police, he said a sentence, the bearded, a particularly hip big data. Oh, fuck my wife will kill me. Laughed at the time. Ha ha ha, he thought of the first point is the wife, this time certainly to find him trouble, because he felt that cannot run away. Finally this thing then after the end, carried him on the ambulance to carry away. Everyone should go on, where to go. Finally arrived at the guest of the place, the bar after the guest specifically told me, sorry, that delayed so long, to pay me more money. I immediately told him that no, I said just now I stopped the table, you do not have to give me any more money. I really even a little bit hate to say, are saving people, you still talk about what money are. In the end it was just so normal to end this thing. But that thing to my first time this shock is very big, is to think that everyone's first reaction to encounter such things, the instinctive reaction is so different, so that moment I think, but also especially feel that it may be true, like everyone said this in human nature, the relationship between people and what is not the same? Of course, after I understood the system here, I found that you can't just rely on people's hearts, it is actually more because there is a system behind the support, because after this thing, I went to check out the system of dealing with traffic accidents. I found that he is very different from the domestic. Yes, in Australia, the so-called annual license fee, he has about 700, 800 Australian dollars per year, which is relatively expensive, like the annual inspection fee or road maintenance fee and so on. But it actually, you get that invoice, you find that after the separation, the real handover to the traffic department that fee is only 100, 200 Australian dollars, most of the 600, 700 are that, a thing called similar to the traffic insurance. This traffic insurance only insures the person, the casualty in the accident. It is unlimited, this insurance company will take care of you until you die. And, in my later contact with the guests, because I was in contact with disabled people, they know that this is not just a joke. This is not the most basic, so that you can eat 3 meals a day, all these costs, in addition to a part of the government, is covered by this insurance. So, under the premise of such a system, I think anyone who has a traffic accident, the first time after the responsibility, of course, want to save people. Because, the psychological expectation is that there is no economic, and my own responsibility after the worry, you can release human nature. If we also have such an insurance system in China, I believe that in fact, the porcelain are, what these old people fell without help, these conditions will not happen.
Just now Wei also said that the big car he drove maxi taxi is mainly used to serve people with disabilities. In order to ensure that they can live a quality of life, Australia provides a large number of benefits for people with disabilities so that they can work and study like ordinary people. In fact, Wei met many disabled friends in the process of driving this taxi, several of whom were students at the University of Melbourne. One of them was a boy who impressed Wei the most.
His name is Owen, and the first time I met Owen was, one day I was driving until about 6 p.m. or so. I was driving around downtown, and this time the owner of that car gave me a call, and he said there was a customer you hadn't picked up, and he had a temporary, class was over now, and he needed you to pick it up, because the original driver couldn't seem to get back at that time, and then told me where. Also the University of Melbourne, and then, in another neighborhood I drove over there. I waited for him there, and I put the crane down behind the car. By this time about 10 minutes later, I saw a man coming, in a wheelchair, and I saw from a distance that he was not very steady. It was a section, a stop, a drive, a stop, and the direction was not so straight, a little twisted. So I went over to see him, and then I walked over. The first time I walked over I was honestly a little, although I have seen so many disabled people, but I was still a little surprised, because he had no limbs. Legs and feet are not, he only has a little bit of protrusion above the shoulder, he just cannot use, because there is no hand structure, he is using his neck in looking at that wheelchair. The man is also a modified controller, put it in the middle. Then there was a place on top where he could point, so his chin could lean on it, so he was leaning his chin on that place, and then using his neck in motion. But perhaps because the neck is not able to extend a fixed angle to maintain, so it is a section of the walk, and the neck is not so flexible, the control of the words, so the route is more tortuous, but he is walking, he is looking for himself. When I saw him, I said hello first. I asked him if he was Owen, and he said yes, hello, very happy and a very happy face. Then I asked him, do you want to help, and he said no. He said let's go, I'm done. He spoke, and I noticed that he actually spoke incoherently and very slowly. It's probably similar to, if you say, Atilda, what did you eat this morning? He'll say, this morning, and it's slow and slurred, but he's willing to talk. We started talking in the car. He was slow and not particularly clear, but he knew what the point of what he was saying, and he knew he was slow, so he didn't talk so much nonsense and got straight to the point, and we talked in this way all the way back to his home, and I talked about China, and he didn't have much contact with Chinese people. He talked about what he was doing here. He said he was studying that at the University of Melbourne, criminology, and then in addition to the usual classes here, he would also sometimes go and help with the research of some of the government agencies. So then I did pick him up and take him to these institutions, including seminars and so on. As long as he was out of the house, he lived all by himself, using his neck to drive his wheelchair, and then put a cell phone in front of the wheelchair with a frame, and he used his nose to control it. Later, when I met him at school, he would take the initiative to ask me, how is your study situation here? Is there anything you are not used to? I said I was not used to it, that is, the assignments here. Well, every course will make you write papers and have to go to lectures, and I said sometimes I can't write, I don't know what to write. He laughed at that time, and he told me, he said, easy, argue, and then he said, in fact, here homework writing things, no matter how, you do not care what ideas you have right or wrong, especially you have to speak with the teacher is not the same, and constantly with him to argue. Take out your own ideas too, do not care right or wrong, hear that vibrant words argue. That is, he himself also added that tone. I thought, oh, okay, I'll try. And then, sure enough, at the end he asked us how we were doing. Well, we passed with a high score, and we were very happy, everyone was very happy. So he was making me feel particularly uplifted that he was reading this by himself, and of course is not the same as a normal person. He might have said to me that he wanted someone else to read for about 2 years, he wanted 5 years, but no problem, he was able to give it very normally, so that's what made me feel that they were a normal friend just like a normal friend. To be able to give you help, to give you their different views, their experiences, some of their things, they are not just enjoying the institutional benefits and help, they are also giving normal feedback to society, and there's no intentional place, because this kind of person may be in China, under our original culture, we'll put it in a special context, he's a special person. He can still do this kind of he is a special person who can do such things. He will be used as a positive teaching material to promote the typical. But not here, he is just an ordinary person. I have a client who I pick up every Saturday night at 8 or 9 p.m. He's in a wheelchair and he can't talk. And then I pick him up at about 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock, and he goes every week because he's happy, he can't even talk, but his family and his recovery knows that he'll be happy that way. Well, it would just let him go to some daily life like that.
If you have a family member or friend with a disability, I suggest you take him out for a walk. Don't stay at home all day if you want him to be a normal person. You're watching MetaNights, and I'm Anchor Loku. Thank you for listening, and we will see you next time.